your boy Blackbeard Mirage. I'm back. What's happening? Salute to all the various Aboriginal people of the North American continent, Central America, South America, wherever you at. And also salute to anybody else on any other continent of any other ethnicity or nationality that may be listening to this tape at this present time. So, of course, you know who this is. This is the boy Blackbeard. We're in another Midnight Mirage Classic. And what we're going to do in this tape is deal with some more Aboriginal American history. We're going to look into some documents, dig around on some concepts and things that we already are familiar with. We're going to add to those things. And we're going to basically clear some cobwebs in this tape. So this tape is going to be basically a big overview. It's going to be a review of what we've been dealing with the last few months. And then we're going to kind of go forward from that, okay? First thing I want to do is salute a brother by the name of Autochthonous one. He put out a tape recently that was dropping some real good classics and some jewels. And I did my research into some of the, bibliography that the brother dropped. And I came across a good document that I'm using in this tape. So I just want to salute and thank him for putting in his work and doing his due diligence. And I also want to salute and thank all the other people that have been dealing with the Aboriginal American history and trying to clear that up. All right. So what we're going to do in this tape, like I said, we're going to just review some things. We're going to have an overview. So in the previous, it's like in the last two tapes or so, I kind of hinted at and talked about the indigenous Europeans and how a lot of their, misappropriating and mishandling of their own civilizations and their own societies, depleting their land, depleting their resources, and more importantly, them creating a system of slavery. And long story short, the inmates start running the asylum. Or in other words, these slaves of some of these indigenous Europeans or the so-called indigenous Africans, their slaves or their serf class basically began to rule over them. And they were obligated to help these slave classes that they, once were so dependent upon. And I talked about how, although the indigenous people of the Americas are, we can say, cousins to the indigenous people of so-called Europe and Africa, but nevertheless, we are two different people that had two different cultures, two different identities, two different, nationalities. We had two different governments, etc. Okay. So although we were, a people that were related as far as being indigenous to the earth, although we did do a lot of international trade with them, although we did, exchange a lot of scientific ideas, although we did have a lot of interaction with them, but nevertheless, we were identified as, people indigenous to our particular lands. So if you were an indigenous American, that was your identity. And if you were indigenous to so-called Europe or Africa, that was your identity. So somewhere, along the line, when these indigenous Europeans that we know of in history as, Moors, these people had to pay the piper. Now, before I go much deeper, let's go into this word Moor real quick, because we want to always make things very, very simple and very, very basic. And we don't want shit confused. OK. In some of my titles and in some of the tapes that you will hear if you listen to my old stuff and some of the tapes even in the future and in this tape, sometimes you will hear me use the word Moor. OK. Or I may even use the word Moors. All right. Now, I'm letting you know right now, whenever I use that word, I'm always using it to describe the physical appearance of a people. OK, so I'm talking about the copper colored people of the earth. Whenever I looked at it in literature, this was the basic root understanding that I got of the word. All right. So it was the word that was, it's describing a particular people. It's not a nationality to me. But nevertheless, it's describing somebody. So, and I will prove that in a minute when I get into my reading. But what you have is that you had indigenous Europeans who had their own, like I said, their own governments. And they were, citizens of their own governments. They had their own religion, culture, etc. Just like we had over here. But when you had a lot of these invasions and people coming over here with their forms of culture, etc., you starting to have a lot of conflicts that come off of that. So, as I said in the previous tape, there is, a history, and it's known that these indigenous Europeans or these indigenous Africans when a lot of them came to the Americas, they had intention on colonizing the Americas. Okay. Now, and I also told you that, you know, we have been doing trade with them and we've had interaction with them throughout the last hundreds of years or even thousands of years. But some of them we were cool with and some of them we were not cool with. OK, so when we say these indigenous Europeans or these indigenous Africans or these so-called Moors, see, some of them we are cool with and some of them we're not cool with. All right. So when you look at a lot of these Moors in history who are known as dirty Moors and a lot of them who were, you know, raising up these slavish Caucasians, you know, educating them through the Freemasonic system, allowing them to be, you know, Mamelukes and Janissaries within their armies and things of this nature. And then using these Caucasian Christians, these freed and accepted Masons, to go and fight against other indigenous people and take their stuff. You know, this is what some of these indigenous Europeans or so-called Moors, this is some of the stuff they were doing. All right. So please do know that when we talk about the Boule, when we talk about the, you know, the Talented 10th and all these other early 20th century, you know, so-called black noble groups, these are these dirty Moors, or you can look at it as these sellout so-called blacks that were helping and aiding a lot of these Caucasians in their, you know, navigation over here, etc. Okay. So I guess what I'm saying is that, just like I said in the previous tape, you know, because these indigenous Europeans are so-called Moors, whatever you want to call them, because they abused their own lands, and because they started to depend on a system of slavery. Okay. This led them to spiritually go in a downward spiral. All right. And what they did was they started to look elsewhere for more resources. And one of those places was the Americas. So some of these indigenous Europeans had intention of coming over here with bullshit. All right. So what I'm going to read now is, like I said, we're going to jump around. It's a little PDF I have called 103 Facts About the Black Indian. This was actually what I saw the brother Autochthonous one talking about. OK, so we're going to look at this a little bit, you know, go deeper into some of what it's talking about. And there is also a particular part that goes into these international indigenous Europeans, okay, or so-called Moors. All right. So I'm going to jump around, but I'm going to start at number 17. So it says, all native people or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, spoke different dialects of a language synonymous to the Hebrew language. So the first fact that, you know, is in this book is that the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, or the so-called Indians, were speaking different dialects of a language that is synonymous to Hebrew. Okay. So the first thing is that the indigenous or the old America or ancient America, one of the primary languages here was Paleo-Hebrew. Okay. Paleo-Hebrew. Now you had probably different slangs of it, different dialects of it, you know, maybe different versions of it, etc. But the mother tongue or the mother language was a Paleo-Hebrew or an ancient Hebrew type of language. Okay. So that's a thing you can put in your head as far as an Aboriginal American. You know, as far as your nationality, you know, it would have to be something concerning being indigenous or Aboriginal to America. All right. I wouldn't say that your nationality is something about being Moorish or anything like that. You know, just being all the way 100. Like I said, that word is more describing, you know, describing an appearance as far as I'm concerned. So I wouldn't really say your nationality is Moorish. It would have to be indigenous American or Aboriginal American or something concerning you being tied to the lands of the Americas. All right. So that's the first thing. And then one of the cultures that the Aboriginal American or the so-called Indian was practicing here is the culture of what we know of as the so-called Hebrew culture. Okay. Now we know that Hebrew is a language, and we know that Hebrew is the language that's used in the religion or the culture that we know of as Judaism. But nevertheless, that is one of the old cultures that was here in the Americas. All right. Most European writers during the 1400s throughout the 1800s, including the pale-skinned Jews, all agreed that the, quote, heathen savage of the Western Hemisphere, aka the Indians throughout the Americas, were without a doubt descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Okay, so it's saying that during the early, or during the 1800s and throughout the during the 1400s and throughout to the 1800s, that many of these Caucasian European writers, including the pale-skinned Jews, all agreed that the heathen savage of the Western Hemisphere was in doubt the descendant of the lost tribes of Israel. Okay, so just think this in your head real quick. We read in the so-called Bible, they talk about the tribes of Israel. All right, you have these 12 tribes. You know, you got the tribe of Levi, the tribe of Judah, etc. Okay, think about the various tribes of the Americas. You know, you may have the Mississippian, the Creek, the Osage, the Anasazi, etc. Okay, so these different various so-called Native American tribes are no different than the different tribes of Israel. Okay, so it's somewhat of an analogy. So when you think about the tribes of Israel, keep in mind the tribes of America. So Israel and America have to be somewhat the same, because if you think about, let's say, the Seminole Indian, well, if it's a Seminole Indian, you know, that may be the so-called tribe, but what land are they from? The land would be the Americas, right? So let's say you have the so-called tribe of Judah, you know, but what land or what primary place do they come from? And that's Israel, right? So Israel will have to be the land or the geographic location of these various tribes, just like America is the geographic location of the various Native American tribes. Okay, so when we say the, you know, like I said, if we're talking about the you know, the Delaware or the Iroquois, let's say, that I immediately know that I'm talking about the lands of America. I'm not going to think that the Iroquois are somewhere in Africa, you know, or the Iroquois are somewhere in Australia. You know, if anytime you say Cherokee, let's say, people are going to think indigenous tribes to America. All right. Now, what's giving people a lot of problems is, you know, when they read the Old Testament about the Israelites, and then they look at that present, you know, state of Israel that was created in 1947 after World War II, which was to create the false state of Israel to hijack the original history here in the Americas. You know, they think that Israel is that state that they see in the Middle East today, you know, which is not true. That state of Jerusalem is not the true state. You got to remember that most of the problems that they have out there is because a lot of those Arab nations who at least been there prior to them, like Palestine, they know that that is not the true state of Jerusalem or the real state of Israel. So most of the problems that they have are strictly coming off of that, the fact that they know that they are a false people. Okay. So it's well known throughout a lot of literature that these lost tribes of Israel are very, very synonymous to the lost tribes or the various tribes of the Americas. Continuing. A pale-skinned European by the name of James Adair, an English writing and trader during the 18th century, lived among black Indians in the Southeast. James Adair wrote a book entitled History of the American Indian. In his book, he claimed that the Indians of the Western Hemisphere were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. James Adair, in his book, History of the American Indian, wrote 23 arguments to support his findings that the so-called American Indians were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Let's move on. All right, so remember we was talking about the word Moor. Let's go into this a little bit. The term Moor was applied to dark-skinned, brown-skinned, and reddish-brown-skinned people who were not only indigenous to Europe, but to West and North Africans. Even black Indians of the Western Hemisphere were also dubbed with this title. Okay, so like we said, this word Moor, it really doesn't have anything to do with like a nationality. It's just describing a particular people. So that's why sometimes you'll hear me say that, you know, when I hear the word Moor, that's gonna make me think about an Aboriginal person, basically. Now, I'm not saying that the nationality of the Aboriginal person is a Moor. I'm not saying that. What I'm basically saying is that, oh, you must be talking about one of the copper-colored people, one of the brown-skinned people, one of the reddish-brown-skinned people, you know, one of the dark-skinned people of the planet. That's just what I'm going to think. I'm not going to think somebody of Morocco, you know, or anything like that, because I see a lot of people out there kind of on that. You know, and once again, I'm going to let y'all be on that. I'm not going to get in the way of that. But just know here on the Midnight Mirage, anybody that's dealing with it here, we're not saying that, you know, Moor is a nationality. I'm not saying you got to be a member of the Moorish Science Temple, you know, that you got to have one of their cards or any of that. Once again, I don't know who's running that. That could be all government, you know, Freemasonic stuff, all I know. Because like I said before, and as we're going to see here in a minute, that a lot of those black nobility of so-called Europe, these were these Moors. And a lot of them aided these pale-skinned Europeans, okay? So when they set up the Boule and like a lot of their Freemasonic systems, the fake version of the mystic Arabic shrine and all that different stuff, you know, they changed a lot of the indigenous Aboriginal energy of it. So these dirty Moors, you know, these are not the people that we really are talking about being associated with, okay? So, you know, once again, you know, if you hear me use this word, you know, I'm not talking about no damn nationality. Like, I don't know what the fuck them people got going on in them buildings, you know. Because honestly, I look at it like this. If those people in the Moorish Science Temple was really doing something like that, then they would be making a whole lot more noise than they really are. And the condition of the people probably could be a little bit better, you know. So that's just me personally. Like, I'm not giving it too much thought. I'm not going into it too much. But all I'm saying is that this term Moor, like whoever wrote this book, I view the word Moor kind of like them. You know, the term Moor was applied to dark-skinned, brown-skinned, and reddish brown-skinned people. So that means that, you know, there could have been Moors in Australia, Asia, Africa, America, you know, Alaska, anywhere. Like anywhere it was brown-skinned people, you know, that's probably where the term could be applied. All right. Now, am I saying this is your nationality? I'm not saying that. Okay? I'm not saying that. So don't get confused into that. So listen up. Let's keep going. Indigenous black Celtics, indigenous black Britons, indigenous black Portuguese, and indigenous black Spaniards, all also known as Moors, had a long time knowledge of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. These, quote, Moors were well informed of the different customs, traditions, and languages of the natives of the Western Hemisphere. These dark-skinned Europeans, or Moors, were used as buffers by pale-skinned Europeans to help colonize the New World. These indigenous black Europeans, aka Moors, not only solicited the New World to pale-skinned Europeans, but also waged a war on indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. So let's go from the top to the bottom. So as I said, this word Moor is just, you know, referring to dark-skinned people. But anyway, they saying that, you know, we talk about the indigenous Celtics, the indigenous Britons, the indigenous Portuguese, the indigenous Spaniards. These are Moors. So when we say indigenous Europeans, we basically just talking about the Moors, you know, the copper-colored people who are indigenous to that land. Then it goes on also to say that they had a long time knowledge of indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. Well, we know that because we've been always trading with them. There was a point in time when the entire world was connected, you know, in the stages of Pangea. So, of course, they knew about us. You know, like I said, we haven't been always, you know, warring with them. You know, there was some indigenous Europeans we was cool with and did trades with them. And then there was some indigenous Europeans that we were not cool with and we was going to war with them. And this was long before any Caucasian pale person came around. All right. Then it goes on to say that these Moors were well informed of the different customs, traditions, and languages of the natives of the Western Hemisphere. Of course they were. Then it says that these dark-skinned Moors were used as buffers by pale-skinned Europeans to help colonize the New World. This is exactly what they did. Like I said, if these indigenous Americans are y'all's cousins, you know, why in the hell would you bring these pale-skinned people over here, you know, knowing what the intention of these people are, helping them with maps, you know, and all this other stuff. You know, this is sellout shit. This is traitor shit, you see. And then, like I said, too, some of those Moors had lost and fucked up their own indigenous land. So they start trying to look elsewhere and start trying to bother our stuff. because they knew that we were living a real, real noble, real humble way of life over here. And we had a life of abundance. So a lot of the Moors was jealous of us. You see, they living over in Europe where it's all close space. You know what I'm saying? It's rats and shit everywhere. Because like I said, they had a slave society. So that means that they're, the serf class lived a little bit near where they lived. That's where you have a lot of the feudalism and stuff like that. In order to save a lot of these Caucasian Christians that they had, raised up, they would just have them somewhere living around where their castle is, working around that area all damn day or something like that. So basically what I'm saying is that these, indigenous Europeans, they got very, very close with these pale-skinned people. And over here in Americas, we weren't doing stuff like that. These pale-skinned people weren't over here. We didn't, that shit wasn't going down like that. Now, I will say what was fucked up over here is that you had a lot of tribalism. You had a lot of indigenous tribes fighting each other. So that's another thing. So that, let's put that out there too. You got a lot of people out here that's doing the Aboriginal American thing, and don't make it seem like, this shit was just this peaceful thing over here. Because there are a lot of information out there that'll tell you that the reason why we got fucked up here is because we had so much tribalism. We was fighting each other so much, and we didn't even have a national army. We had tribal armies. We may have had certain Confederate armies, but we didn't have a national army. That's why when you look at the Revolutionary War, it was Aboriginals fighting on both sides. When you look at the French and Indian War, it was Aboriginals fighting on both sides. When you look at the Creek Wars, it's Aboriginals fighting on both sides. When you look at the American Civil War, it's Aboriginals fighting on both sides. So we weren't together over here. So let's not play that bullshit. Because Aboriginal people, we have a tendency to play this righteous, noble type of, fuck that. Just the same way like them Moors over there was dirty as fuck. We was dirty as fuck here too. That shit's facts. I can't tell you how many accounts that I came across of these different Aboriginal tribes fighting each other and shit over, over thunder sticks, which is basically firearms, and fire water, which is the alcohol and stuff like that. The chief getting drunk and stuff like that, making land deals and all kind of weird ass shit. So let's not make it seem like that these indigenous Americans weren't on no fuckery. Oh, they was on some fuckery, all right. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't be in this shit right now. But anyway, let's continue. It says certain black indigenous Europeans, aka Moors, that went under such titles as clergymen and European nobility, shared a common consciousness with pale-skinned Europeans. That common consciousness being that the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were untamed heathen savages. So it says right here that these indigenous black Moors, that some of them, not all of them, but it says some of them had a consciousness that the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere were untamed heathen savages. So a lot of us, when you see the so-called white man and the type of terminology he has towards us, his mentality towards us, etc., some of us may have thought that he created those ways, just that he's this racist, evil person and all this stuff. Well, what if I told you that the Caucasian man learned his hatred for the Aboriginal American from the Moorish nobility of Europe? Those Christian Moors of Europe. Some of them Islamic Moors of Europe. What if I told you that he learned his hatred for you from them? What if he learned his lack of respect for you from them? I mean, think about it. You really think he was moving any kind of weight when he was coming over here? Of course not. His ass didn't move until them Moors told him to move. He didn't get shit until them Moors gave him some shit. So I think that when this cracker was sitting back watching us fighting each other so much, he's seeing like, all he's seeing is just people who look like each other fighting each other. He's seeing indigenous Americans fighting indigenous Americans. Before he came over here on the boat, he was seeing Moors fighting Moors in Europe. Then he's seeing Moors fighting, indigenous Americans. So he just seeing like, well, wait a minute. These motherfuckers all fighting each other. What if I just sit back and play these motherfuckers and then just fuck all of them over? And that's exactly what he did. But nevertheless, he learned this whole mentality of, these heathen savages and all this different stuff. He learned that shit from that black nobility, the boule, the 1%, That's who he learned this shit from. You know? So when we think about, you know, those, when you think about the Queen Elizabeth in the English Parliament, and when you think about people who speak the King's English or that perfect English, most of y'all, and then you got ignorant Negroes today that say shit like, oh, you know, you trying to speak white. You ever heard that before? Like people who speak proper or they use English real proper, they'll say stuff like, oh, you trying to speak white. Not knowing that that's not even a white way of speaking. That's how those nobles of Europe, those Moorish nobles of Europe, that's how they were speaking. And a Caucasian Christian learned that way of talking from them. So yeah, the same way that the so-called Caucasian Christian was calling us heathens and savages, that's what those Moorish nobles of Europe was calling us too. Because once again, we weren't cool with all of them. And that shit's facts. So I can see why, you know, some of these people that's dealing with the Aboriginal American history, you know, why they don't fuck with those Moors. This is why, you know. Now, what's interesting and what's kind of what they need to do is realize that the word Moor is basically just describing, you know, the physical appearance of a person. What they should really be saying is that we have an issue with the indigenous Europeans and the indigenous African. That would center more in on who they really dealing with. But when they say that they have a problem with Moors, honestly, we may not really know who they talking about. Because when they say that to me, I don't know who they talking about. I'm thinking, are you know, that's like saying like, oh, I got a problem with that nigga over there or that black person over there. But if it's a room full of black people, I'm not going to know who you talking about. And see, a lot of people who kind of dig deep and they don't really choose a side in any of this. They know that that word Moor just is describing basically everybody that's non-so-called white, you know. And somewhere along the line, you had a trickery that, you know, associated this word with Morocco and all this other stuff and made it real confusing, just like they did with the word Jewish. You know, the word Jewish in Hebrew, you know, that's a language. So how did Hebrew become a people? Now, once again, if you say the indigenous nation of Israel, now that's a people. But if you say, oh, that Hebrew, now, once again, in modern text, for us that have been reading and studying, you know, we know what they may be talking about. But let's say that you say, oh, that Hebrew. But let's say it's a Caucasian man that speaks Hebrew. Let's say it's an indigenous American that speaks Hebrew. And let's say it's a man from Australia, you know, and he speaks Hebrew. So if I say the Hebrew, I mean, which one of them am I really talking about? Because at the end of the day, Hebrew really is a language. Now, is that language to a specific people, which being the nation of Israel? Yes, it is. But nevertheless, it is a language. So even when we say Hebrew Israelite, when I hear that, I think Israelites that speak Hebrew. But you could say Arabic Israelite, I'm going to think Israelites that speak Arabic. You could say English Israelite, I'm going to think Israelites that speak English. You know? Now, could I be wrong? Of course I could be wrong. Once again, I'm a student in the game. Like, don't ever think that I know everything. Of course I don't. You know? But when I hear Hebrew Israelite, that makes me think an Israelite or a person of Israel that speaks Hebrew. Now, do we know that the original people of Israel fashioned and manifested the Hebrew language? Of course. But at this point in history, you got so many people who didn't come from Israel that are speaking Hebrew. So we can no longer say the Hebrew and then expect somebody to think that we're talking about a person of Israel. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of these terminologies and a lot of the lexicon, you know, is just very, very confusing. So we got to be careful with the word more, you know, the word Hebrew and all these different things. We got to be real careful on this stuff. OK, we got to be real, real careful. So next, let's check this out. Both dark-skinned and pale-skinned Europeans who were either Celtic, Briton, Gaelic, or what have you, who were fleeing religious persecution in Europe and were struggling to preserve ancient traditional customs, dubbed pagan ways upon arrival to the New World, or really the Old World, ran to the bosom of black Indian nations indigenous to the Western Hemisphere soil, who still held on to and were practicing traditional spirituality. Both cultures were different. However, both were able to relate to each other's gods. Black Indian nations and different clans native to Europe both shared, a common spirituality that centered around the forces of nature and the honoring of the ancestral spirits. So what this is saying is that you had indigenous Europeans who were, Celtic, British, Gaelic, etc., and some pale-skinned Europeans were fleeing from Europe for religious persecution. Of course, we know what that was. That was the Spanish Inquisition by the Catholic Church. So everybody that wasn't practicing Catholicism, the blue-eyed, pale version of Jesus, was viewed as a heretic, an infidel, etc. So those were going to be all your Hebrews and all your Muslims, or people dealing with Islam, all right, or so-called Moors. So they were fleeing from Europe, and of course we know some of them came here, all right. Then it says that a lot of them, absorbed into the Black Indian nations that were indigenous to the West. And it said although they had different cultures, they were able to relate to each other's gods. They were able to relate because they shared common spirituality that centered around the forces of nature, and they honor ancestral spirits. So the indigenous Europeans had a lot in common with the indigenous American. One was they both honored ancestral spirits. Their spirituality centered around the forces of nature. Okay. So like I said, you're going to find a lot of ties and a lot of similarities between the indigenous people of the West and the indigenous people of the East. It says certain Moors helped to navigate Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. He wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was going simply because of who was on the boat with him. So we already know about those dirty Moors. So once again, we got to be very specific of who we're talking about. So listen to this. It says, when the American Revolutionary War broke out, Black Indians found themselves fighting against their own kinsmen. Some Black Indians sided with the British, while other Black Indians sided with the colonial rebels. So you see that right there? Like I just told you. This shit wasn't peaches and cream here. We were so divided. That shit was ridiculous. Listen to this part. It says that Black Indians were not conquered by Europeans or the so-called white man. Black Indians had a rich history of intertribal warfare against each other that continued before and after European arrival. The intertribal warfare that existed among Black Indians in the Western Hemisphere was so great that it left them in a state of impotency. With impotency setting in after years and years of clan warfare, in addition to the attraction of European trinkets, customs, and traditions, and the worshiping of the white god named Jesus, all assisted in paving the way for European occupancy of Black Indian lands, their spirits, and their minds. So let's go from this shit from the top down. So first it says that the indigenous Americans were not conquered by Europeans, and they had a rich history of intertribal warfare against each other that continued before and after European arrival. So the reason why we didn't have no national army is because we was fighting each other. Then it says that the intertribal warfare existed between the Aboriginals of the Western Hemisphere, and it left them in a state of impotency. That's why we got caught off guard here. You see, is this shit starting to make sense? Then it says that, you add in the European trinkets, worshiping the white Jesus, etc. This paved the way for the European occupancy of America. So we did this shit ourselves. So I really don't want to hear shit about no Moors. Nor do I want to hear shit about no white man. Matter of fact, that's really kind of where this shit is at now. I don't want to hear shit about no fucking Moors. And I really don't want to hear shit about no fucking white man after reading this shit. This shit said Black Indians had a rich history of intertribal warfare amongst each other that continued before and after the European arrival. So if this shit is about the Moors and the European, then why were we fighting before them, and then why were we fighting after them? If this shit is so much about them, if they really fucked us over this much, then why were we doing this shit? If we don't have our nationality and we were stripped of all this stuff because of the Moors, because Morocco colonized us, because the white man came with his this, that, and the third, You know, if this was the case, then what the fuck were we doing before they got here then? Then it says, after the colonial government was established, Black Indian nations continued to aid the new colonial government with military assistance on the other Black Indian nations that fought against European expansion and the taking of ancestral land. So here you have right here that after these bastards created a colonial government, that you still got indigenous people helping them continue to fight their own brother and sister so these crackers can keep this new shit. Then it says that General Mad Anthony Wayne, aka Black Snake, was a Black Indian who served under George Washington's administration. The army of General Anthony Wayne consisted of mostly Black Indians in rank, as did the entire colonial government army. Besides Black Indians making up the bulk of the colonial government army, Moors also filled up the ranks. So what you have right here then with this dude, George Washington, which was a Caucasian pale male, under his army, he had an indigenous American by the name of Black Snake, who had other indigenous Americans help him fight. So it says that George Washington's army was made up of indigenous Americans and then indigenous Europeans, aka so-called Moors, who came with him. So if we're going to get mad at the Moors, then we got to get mad at these same indigenous Americans that we claim we are. It says George Washington established treaties or contracts with various Indian nations as well as with the Moors for military support against other Black Indian nations who did not support the occupancy of the new colonial government. So here you have right here a lot of these treaties and stuff that's being set up. They really only set them up with people that's helping them. Okay, it's setting them up with people that's helping them. Because it's like, just because, let's say, you know, let's say just because the Choctaw make a deal with the British or whoever, that's not speaking for all the other Aboriginal tribes. You see, just because the Carolina Aboriginals make a deal with, you know, the whoever, that don't mean that the Virginian Aboriginals are going for that. Because like I said, we were not together. We weren't together. That's why the whole shit felt like it just did. It did, because we just weren't together. Then it says that after the colonial government confiscated most Black Indian lands, the colonial government refused to pay Black Indian warrior pensions for their military support. So these same dumbass Aboriginals that helped them out and these same dumbass Moors that helped them out, they fucked both of them over. So once again, how's the Aboriginal American any smarter or any different than the indigenous European or the so-called Moor? He's no fucking different. Both of them dumb. Keep it 100. It says there were thousands upon thousands of Black Indians who fought in the American Civil War and in wars before and after this war, who were Black Indians or native to the Western Hemisphere, but were oblivious to this fact. They only thought themselves to be Negroes. Their parents and their parents' parents, who had lost knowledge of themselves, in all honesty, simply passed on to the next generation the colonized title of Negro to their children. Thus, an unbroken chain of ignorance continues to survive. So what happened is when they was in doing all these treaties and deals with these people, hanging around them, speaking their language, they just slowly forgot who they were. And then start telling their children that they Negroes. That's why we think that shit to this day. Let me see. Let me see what I'm going to take y'all at now. Yeah, look, it says many Black Indian chiefs were put on annual salaries by different European nations throughout the 16, 17, and 1800s. European nations such as French or France, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and the Dutch paid Black Indian chiefs of the Western Hemisphere a salary for their support